Now Bernie Sanders, of course, later asked, as he often is, he's a senator, asked a lot about politics. He was asked his thoughts on the 2020 election, and Bernie Sanders, in very Bernie Sanders fashion, had an answer.
This is incredible, and I have to say this in all due respect. Are we ready? We haven't inaugurated this president, and we're talking about 2020 because it's easy to write about. What about talking about climate change and whether the planet survives? What about talking about income and wealth inequality in America? What about talking about youth unemployment in African-American communities of 30-40%? What about talking about immigration reform, criminal justice reform? Those are the issues that the American people need to be engaged in. To start talking about who's going to be running in 2080 and look at you, oh, you look like a good candidate. I mean, how much money do you have? Maybe we'll run you. I mean, I don't mean to be rude, but the American people are tired of that. They really are. They would like to hear serious discussion on serious issues. Who's running in 2020 or 2090 is of concern. And I got to tell you, people are turning off their TVs. They are tired of, all of that stuff.
I love that. I hadn't seen it. I read it. And, obviously Michael and I talked, and we've already talked about who's going to run in 2020, and we will again. And I get why the guy asked it. But, having been a reporter for a long time, man, it's a lot easier. That's the easy story. And the question was not just about 2020. What do you think's on Cory Booker? Right? So it was like, hey, let's ask him about Cory Booker. See if Bernie's saying Cory Booker. He's an interesting guy. He makes a powerful progressive case, but has these ties to Wall Street. Like, let's see what Bernie has to say about him. And what you have to like about Bernie is his refusal to play that game, his refusal to get what would unquestionably be, because I think when he answers this, he doesn't know it's going to make news. I really don't, because
of course not.
Yeah, but a Cory Booker answer is going to make news, and he'd get on TV and whatever. But no, but he is determined that these are the things we ought to be talking about.
But I also understand the urge to. I mean, this is a man who ran for president, right? And the urge is to say, "All right, it's over now. Who do you like next time? You're a guy who ran." I mean, I think that question goes to Mitt Romney all the time and Michael Dukakis all the time.
Sure, of course. So, and I understand it, but it is a nice example of what is wrong, of the direction journalism has gone, because that is the easiest story to write in the world. That's why Tim Russert asked it every single week.
Yeah.
Right? You're going to run? You're not going to run? Hey, and I would say that you're giving up an hour of airtime to, we had a debate where Mosul beat climate change 41-0. They talked about Mosul. Trump didn't even know where Mosul is, but he's talking about Mosul. The words climate change were never spoken.
He's not going to win.
Yeah, right. Those words were never spoken at the debate. There is a point where we have to, nothing we can do to assess it. We hope that journalists themselves assess the manner in which we cover politics. And, Anna and you and I argue all the time because she's like, I don't like the racehorse part of it. And at some point, like when it's October before November, the racehorse part of it is super interesting because the horses are coming down the stretch, right? But to her point, that's a racehorse question now. And I think it's I love that there's a guy who answers it the way Bernie Sanders answered it. I'll leave it at that.
I don't know why he ducks that question. Just tell me. I want to know. What do you think
about Cory Booker?
I agree with you guys, and I like the question. Both. I think there's a place to ask the question. I think if you're sitting with Bernie Sanders and you're trying to get him to talk about politics, that's a question you ask. The shame of it is that you don't have a room full of people who, after that question is asked, are not asking about climate change, or not asking about income inequality, and asking about the other. I think there's room for all of it, not exclusively that.
Like the great reporters, the guys who I admire, the guys who I think you admire too. But like recent in our lives, columnists anyway. Jack Germond would have said, who gives a shit about 2020?
Right.
Like what kind of freaking question is that? You want to start guys talking about 2020? And I just wish there was a little more cynicism for that than what know will be, what would be the headline story is not going to be about climate change. It's not going to be about income inequality or 30 to 40% unemployment in African-American communities, or the fact that both candidates who wanted to do something about making college affordable lost, and there'll be no effort whatsoever to make college affordable. But what we'll get on the page, the front page, is how are the Democrats coming back? Is it Elizabeth Warren? Is it Cory Booker? What does that mean for the party?
And now we don't know what Bernie thinks.
Right.
But be great is what I want is that somebody followed it up, like called his office. That was a good answer, but seriously, Cory Booker.
Right. What do you think, Cory Booker?
What I think a way he could have asked that question, which I wish he would have asked that question, which is what you almost just said, was going forward. What do you see? Do you really think Chuck Schumer is the person to lead this anti-establishment message you have? Do you really think it's Chuck Schumer who's going to deal with income inequality? And maybe that's what he could have said. Or do you think it would be Cory Booker who would be better? Who do you think should lead the Democrats right now? I think that's an appropriate question, don't you think?
Yes, because then he can answer. Because then he can answer about. I think the person who should lead the Democrats will take him in a direction where we talk about these issues. That's how he'd answer that, I presume, which would be an answer to that. But
he's already backed Keith Ellison for the DNC chair, and he would say that would probably be a more appropriate place to do those things and what have you. I don't know, but it doesn't look good. The Democrats don't look like they're really gonna be able to pull themselves together. Does it? It doesn't.
No, I don't know. I have no idea. I disagree that it doesn't look that way. I have no clue what's going to happen. But what I read suggests that they're talking about it. What I read suggests a recognition, like Chuck Schumer or not, a recognition by Chuck Schumer, which I think is critical, of, if I'm going to win, if I'm going to hold on to this caucus, I have to move left. That's where this caucus is. A very quick move to say Keith Ellison. Bernie Sanders said Keith Ellison. Bernie Sanders has power. Elizabeth Warren has power. That's where I recognize it. Will he betray that later? I have no idea. But he's a politician. And I think what gets left out all the time in conversations about the cravenness of politicians and their selling out to money is that they go where the power is. And why I thought it was critical that Hillary won was because then you have a chance to influence power. And it seemed clear to me that the Democratic caucus was moving left, and with effective leadership, could have been pushed left. To your point that it is much harder now for Democrats in the face of this loss to fall back on the way they've done things for the last 16 years. I will concede that. But I think there was a real chance to move the party left, and I think there still is that chance. And I think what Schumer and Reid did is a reflection of that.
Yeah, perfectly said. And also there's insurgency now. I mean, you have somebody like Keith Ellison who is trying to get that job. You have Tim Ryan running against Nancy Pelosi, an uphill battle, but one that was just given without battle to Nancy Pelosi prior to that. He's not exactly the kind of person you'd think that would take the party to the left, but he is saying that we've become the party of the coasts, and we have to become the party of America, not just by talking about it. He probably won't beat Nancy Pelosi. She has a lot of power and a lot of loyalty, and she's created a lot of loyalty and has been good on a lot of things. But you have Democrats sort of saying we do need to change things a little bit. And to Ben's point, that's exactly what will influence Chuck Schumer. Well, listen, there are a lot of different ways to look at Chuck Schumer. He's a senator from New York, and when you're a senator from New York, you're the senator of everyone in New York, not just Wall Street, but other people, but including Wall Street. But I also, you can't overstate the power of a senator, but you can show how the senator is moving his party or following his party to a way that the party on the whole thinks it should be going. And that's something that Chuck Schumer is totally capable of. Look what's happening with Donald Trump already. You see all these Republicans falling in line now. To what Ben just said, follow the power. Go to where the power is, because that's where you can influence. They can't influence by saying, you know what, I'm going to support Paul Ryan because he was my guy, or I was a Ted Cruz guy in the race and I'm going to stay with. No, you go to where the power is, and that's what attracts politicians all the time.
They did make a conscious choice to move towards Wall Street and Silicon Valley and to sell out their base through trade deals like NAFTA and TPP. And I think that we need unions, right? I think we need to build that up again. Like I was talking about, I brought it up to Cenk, what if we tried to unionize the Walmart workers just in California? And what would that have, because it was like Martin Luther King had a lot more to do with things than politicians did in a sense, right? The society moved and then the politicians followed, I think is what happened.
In some cases in history, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's what we need to kind of do again, in a sense, because I keep getting disappointed by Democrats, right? And we're all going to keep getting disappointed by them. And Chuck Schumer, it was nice to see him. But what I remember about Chuck Schumer in 2014 was when he came out and said it was a mistake to do Obamacare. And he railed against the president about that. That was a mistake. People didn't want that. I was like, what? That's, first of all, that's a victory. You guys won, and now you're apologizing for your goddamn victories. And then I played on my show for the last 3 weeks him saying their strategy was, for every blue-collar worker you lose in Pennsylvania, we're going to get 2 or 3 Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And he said you could do that in Ohio, and you can do that in Indiana, and you can do that in Illinois. And he was wrong about that. And so that's that thing that bothers me. It's like...
But there's the thing. He was wrong about that. He's allowed to be wrong, right? I mean, he's a senator. He's got a powerful position. He's allowed to be wrong. I completely agree with you about him with Obamacare. But on the whole, Chuck Schumer was a good congressman. He's been a good senator, and he has fought for many of the things that I am simpatico with, you know. And so but he's allowed to be wrong, and I find that with Joe Biden supported a bankruptcy bill. I couldn't stand him for that one moment. But in the whole breadth of his political life, I've been behind him all the time. I can't just judge him on the bankruptcy bill. You know?
What is undeniable to me is that at least in these early, it's been, 2 weeks, right?
Yes.
13 days. There is a recognition of that. Whether the establishment old way of doing things wins, we don't know. But the pressure and the people who are getting on television are Bernie Sanders, Keith Ellison, and Elizabeth Warren. And literally everything out of Elizabeth Warren's mouth, I want to stand up and cheer. Literally, among them in the last 2 days was, enough of the whining. That's it. Let's go. We got work to do. So I'm literally following her lead and reading her reaction to things. And if she's satisfied, then the party's moving left, because she's not going to drift center.
By the way, when people elected Trump, that was an anti-establishment. That was an anti-Republican Party vote. Right? That's what I think, and that's why he won the primaries. People were upset with the establishment. People were upset with establishment on the left, too. And so I think that's what we need to get back to, was an anti-establishment kind of a look. What do you
I don't know. The establishment is strong and hard to overturn.
You're right. That's where the money
is. I understand, but Democrats have been left before. You can move them back left. There is not, until there's a serious, powerful third party, that's your best bet. The signs early that Chuck Schumer, Harry Reid, and Bernie Sanders got into leadership, and that those 3 people, and as far as I know, I don't know what Elizabeth Warren has said about Keith Ellison, but that those people are supporting Keith Ellison, that is to me a very good sign. Paul Begala, who is as much part of the establishment as there is, was quoting, I don't think it's complicated to win this thing, but the way you have to win it is to be authentic. And he said, look, we learned in this election that it's what Bill Clinton said. It's the economy, stupid. And that was right, because people believed that Bill Clinton was going to look out for them.
Yes.
Right? And then he, in a booming economy, whether it was malicious intent or indifference or selling out, ended up weakening the economic standing of many Americans who were loyal Democrats, who'd been union guys. NAFTA had unforeseen consequences that some people did foresee, but other people didn't. And it turned out the people who warned of the unforeseen consequences were more right than they were wrong. But that message, if it's the economy, stupid, is still the right message. That's what the Trump voters thought, was that this guy will help. That's what populism is. It's not. It's a lot of it is economic populism. I'm not talking about the 50 million racists who voted for
Yes,
him.
we're talking
about the 20 million, or maybe let's go with 30%.
We're
talking
Let's go with 30. About, I don't know. Let's say
It's not about
and
it's about why
they
her
were
vote
unlikables.
I think it was about why her vote wasn't as big or enthusiastic as it could have been.
Yeah. Although she's
should have
going
been.
to end up enthusiasm. We're never going to rate it. She's going
Right.
to end up pretty close to Obama's number. She's ahead right now. It's, again, worth mentioning every day, by 1.7 million votes. She's going to win by 2 million votes. When it's
Already
all
outdoing Kennedy, Nixon, Bush,
in
and
percentage-wise
Carter.
victory. Yeah. So. And she's, at 63 million. Obama just got 65 million, right, last time.
Yeah.
Is that right?
She's close.
Yeah, she's close. So, and turnout went up from 2012. So there was, but of course, most of those extra votes went to Trump.
And Northern Virginia still hasn't come in.
But if you talk about the economy, and Begala's right, if you talk about the economy in a meaningful way, and with meaningful policies and meaningful reduction in the widening gap between rich and poor, and meaningful ways to energize the economy through building infrastructure and giving people jobs, and meaningful trade deals that that do the best we can in a trade deal for workers, then I think you'll win. I think it's not that far away. But you can't simply, especially now after that line has been poisoned, you can't just say it. You have to do it. You have to advocate those policies. And my fear is that that a traditional leadership at the DNC, no national committee in the history of national committees has been as powerful as the created power that the DNC had.
So true.
But nonetheless, it will represent the direction that the party goes in the immediate future until it perhaps is supplanted in 2018. So talk about the economy in a meaningful way that makes a difference in the lives of actual working people. And I think you're poised to win again. That does not address having, I think, 14 state legislatures to 33 controlled by the Republicans, or these staggering numbers where Democrats are lacking.